Should you get the GH5 Mark II or hold on to the original GH5 or wait for the GH6? These are all questions that if you're in the Lumix ecosystem, these are all questions that we have. This video, I'm just going to give some final thoughts on the GH5 Mark II before I have to send it back to Lumix. Lumix, thanks so much for letting me use the GH5 Mark II and let me test it out and see what this camera was all about, because I think there was a little bit of confusion about this GH5 Mark II. These are my final thoughts about this camera. If you're new here, my name's Caleb and I do freelance video with the Panasonic GH5. Now, according to my YouTube analytics, about 75% of you watch my videos but have not hit that subscribe button. If you're part of that 75%, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Like I said, there's a lot of confusion, I think, about the GH5 Mark II. You know, we were kind of hoping for maybe that GH6 announcement, and they said that it was in development. I think it was the spring of 2021. They said that it was in development. We were kind of hoping, you know, after several years of the GH5, since what, 2017, I believe, we were kind of hoping for, you know, that GH6 official announcement. And, you know, they said that it would be here probably within the year of 2021. But 2021 is over at the time of making this video, and there's still no GH6. And we're still waiting for the GH6. But is the GH5 Mark II, is that something that might be worth it at this point? Now, I've said this in pretty much all my videos about the GH5 Mark II. And I'm going to stick with this thought, that if you are brand new to the GH5, the Lumix ecosystem, if you are interested in Micro Four Thirds, I believe that the GH5 Mark II is the right camera to get if you're brand new to it. Now, with that being said, if you are already a GH5 user, a GH5 shooter, and you are comfortable with the GH5, I think that the GH5 is totally fine. You don't need to upgrade to the GH5 Mark II. Now, let's say you have one GH5 and you're looking to add an additional B cam. I would go with the GH5 Mark II if you are adding that new camera to your setup. But if you already have GH5s, I don't think there's a need to upgrade to the GH5 Mark II, because the GH5 is still a killer camera going in to the year of 2022. Now, there's a ton to like about the GH5 Mark II over the GH5, and you know, these might be reasons, maybe reasons to upgrade to the GH5 Mark II. First of all, after testing it, the autofocus is just so much better on the GH5 Mark II than on the original GH5. On the GH5 Mark II, you have the human detect in one area that you can toss on and really dial in those settings. And, you know, if you watch my autofocus test, I'll have it linked up here, but the autofocus was catching pretty quick and staying locked on for the most part. Now, I kind of consider the G9 kind of the king or queen of autofocus when it comes to Lumix cameras, and you know, running some tests with the GH5 Mark II and the G9, the autofocus systems were very, very comparable. The G9 is a little bit more of a photography-centered camera, so you want that autofocus for those photos, but even with the video and continuous autofocus, these cameras with the GH5 Mark II and the G9, they were very, very comparable. First of all, how quickly the autofocus was catching, but then how it stayed locked on. Well, I was the one in the camera, stayed locked on to me during those tests. So yes, the autofocus is better on the GH5 Mark II than the original GH5. Personally, I absolutely never use the autofocus on the GH5. And that's for YouTube videos, that's for client shoots. Whenever I'm using the GH5, I'm always manual focusing. And a lot of people rely on the autofocus, which is totally fine. This is actually usable on the GH5 Mark II. Now, another thing I really liked, and I actually made a video on it, was some of the shoot settings on the GH5 Mark II that I think are better than the original GH5. For example, the Cinema 4K, 60 frames per second at 10-bit 420, and that's internal on the camera, so you don't have to have any external recorder. So you have that DCI 4K on the GH5 Mark II internal at 60 frames per second. Now let me tell you something, that 420 10-bit is a lot easier to work with than 422 10-bit. So actually having that internal and then going, you know, to edit, it was a breeze to edit. So I edit on a 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. It's pretty beefy, but I had no problem at all with that 420 10-bit, you know, the Cinema 4K at 60 frames per second. And I really liked using that setting. Another thing that I really liked about the GH5 Mark II, and again, I made a whole video about this, is the IBIS. I would almost go as far as this. The in-body image stabilization on the GH5 Mark II at 6.5 stops could be a gimbal killer for me. Even handheld walking shots, I was very impressed with how smooth some of those shots were. And I'll have that video linked somewhere, but those walking shots, even walking shots, were pretty smooth with the GH5 Mark II. Now, I've said this before on the channel, and I will probably continue to say this for a very long time, is that I believe that the IBIS performs best in the variable frame rate option. So the variable frame rate obviously is baked in slow motion into that file. So you shoot at full HD at 24 frames per second, set it at a variable frame rate of 120, and there is very, very minimal jitter, hardly any movement in that image when you're shooting with the variable frame rate. So the improved IBIS at 6.5 stops over the GH5 5 stops, I think, is a great improvement on this Mark II version. One of the things I'm a little disappointed about with the GH5 Mark II, and this might be coming in a firmware update, which I'll get to that firmware thing in just a sec, but you know, right now there's no raw external recording, and that's something that the GH5 has lacked. And I think for some people, especially in professional shoot settings, they want that raw external recording. So I think having that option on the GH5, hopefully that'll be on the GH6, but having that option with the GH5 Mark II, I think would be a very nice firmware update. And now let's get to the firmware updates. Now, I believe that the GH5 Mark II was made for those firmware updates, because the GH5 being on an old processor, there's only so much you can do to firmware update that processor. So with the GH5 Mark II having a new processor, it doesn't have a new sensor or anything like that, but a new processor, internal guts of the camera, you're able to now have some of those firmware updates, like for the S5 or the G9, even the GH5S, I believe you can, you know, firmware update even further than the original GH5. So being able to update firmware-wise the GH5, I really think that's why this camera was made. Other than, you know, some of the live streaming capabilities, I really believe that they updated the GH5, made a Mark II version with the new processor so that you can, in the future, basically future-proof your GH5 with those firmware updates. So I think when it all kind of boils down to it, I think that's the main reason for the GH5 Mark II. Let me know your thoughts on that down in the comments. You may totally disagree with that, and that's totally fine. I think that's probably the main reason why they came out with the GH5 Mark II. Should you get the GH5 Mark II or stick with the GH5, wait for the GH6? That's kind of where we're at as Lumix shooters, as GH5 shooters. That's kind of where we're at. Here's kind of the conclusion that I came to. This is a great camera. Now, if I was to purchase a GH5, I would go with the Mark II version. Now, I already have a couple GH5s. I think I'm going to stick with those and wait for the GH6. I think the GH6 is going to be a big enough leap with some of the features that it is going to be worth upgrading the GH5. Well, that's all I have for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you have time, it'd be awesome if you stuck around, maybe watch one of these videos that's popping up on your screen right here. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.